It's a huge question. We're the first people to reach Australia also, the world's first sailors. To get to the heart of it, you have to go back. Way back. Not a few thousand years, but tens of thousands of years. Back to a time when the world looked very different. The ice ages were in full swing. Massive glaciers covered much of the northern hemisphere, and because so much of the world's water was locked up in ice, sea levels were a lot lower. Maybe 150 meters lower than today. This created a different map. What we now know as Southeast Asia was a single huge landmass. Geologists call it Sunda. It connected places like Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula. To the southeast, Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were also joined together. This ancient supercontinent is called Sahul. Between the Great Land of Sunda and the Great Land of Sahul, there was a stretch of water dotted with islands. This region is known as Wallacea, and this is where our story really begins. For a long time, the story of human migration was simple. We thought people basically just walked. Our ancestors came out of Africa and spread across the globe on foot. They followed coastlines. They followed herds of animals. They were land creatures through and through. They crossed rivers, sure, but oceans. That was supposed to be a much, much later development. Something that happened only when civilizations built proper ships. The discovery of ancient human sites in Australia completely shattered that idea. Archaeological evidence, especially from a rock shelter in northern Australia called Baby, pushes the date for human arrival back to at least 65,000 years ago. Think about that for a second. 65,000 years. That's more than 20,000 years before people are thought to have reached Europe. It's an almost incomprehensibly deep stretch of time, and it presents a massive puzzle. The puzzle is Wallacea. Because of the deep ocean trenches that run through it, there was never a land bridge connecting Sunda and Sahul. Not even when sea levels were at their lowest. There was always water, not just a little bit of water, but a series of significant open ocean crossings. To get from the edge of Sunda to the shores of Sahul, you had to cross the sea. You had to do it multiple times. Some of these water gaps were small, maybe a dozen kilometers. But others were vast. The longest and most difficult crossing would have been at least 90 to 100 kilometers. That's like the distance from Dover in England to Calais in France, and back again, and then some. And it wasn't calm, predictable water. The currents in this region are notoriously strong and complex. So, 65,000 years ago, a group of people looked out from a beach on an island in what is now Indonesia, and they made a decision. They decided to go to a place they could not walk to. They decided to cross the water. And they succeeded. They didn't just succeed once. They did it again and again, hopping from island to island until they made that final enormous leap to the continent of Sahul. This was the first time in human history that people had intentionally crossed a major ocean barrier to settle a new world. This single fact is what opens the whole debate. The first thing we have to ask is what they used. What kind of watercraft do they have? The honest answer is we don't know for sure. There is no physical evidence. No 65,000-year-old boat has ever been found. And it's almost certain that none ever will be. The materials they would have used were organic. Wood, bamboo, vines, leaves. In the tropical environment of Wallacea, that stuff would have rotted away in a tiny fraction of the time that has passed. But we can make some very educated guesses. The most likely candidate is a raft. Not just a simple log raft, but a constructed vessel. The region is rich in bamboo. Bamboo is an incredible material. It's strong, light, and wonderfully buoyant because of its hollow, air-filled chambers. A bamboo raft would have been relatively easy to build. People at this time were already sophisticated toolmakers. They knew how to make sharp stone axes to cut the bamboo and scrapers to strip it. They would have known which vines were the strongest for lashing the poles together. Building a sturdy, ocean-going raft was well within their technological capabilities. This wasn't just a matter of tying a few logs together and hoping for the best. It required knowledge of materials, knowledge of design. They would have needed to build something stable enough not to capsize in ocean swells. It needed to be large enough to carry a group of people, not just one or two individuals. And it had to be durable enough to last for a journey that might have taken several days. The very act of building such a craft implies a level of planning, engineering, and abstract thought that we once thought was a much more recent development. So we have the people in a plausible vessel. The next big question is about the journey itself. Was it an accident? For a long time, some scientists proposed a tsunami theory or a storm drift hypothesis. The idea was that a small group of people, maybe a family fishing near the shore on a simple raft were swept out to sea by a freak wave or a storm. They drifted for days, lost and terrified, and by sheer dumb luck, they washed up on the shores of Sahul. It's a dramatic image, but the more you look at it, the less likely it seems. For one, you need more than a few random survivors to start a new population on a massive, empty continent. Genetic studies of Aboriginal Australians suggest a founding population of at least a few hundred, and maybe even 1,000 or more, individuals. A single raftload of accidental castaways wouldn't be enough. You need a genetically diverse group of men, women, and children to create a viable long-term population. This means it wasn't a one-off event. It was a process, a migration. And then there's the island hopping route. It wasn't one single crossing. It was a chain of them. The chances of accidentally drifting across one 100-kilometer gap are tiny. The chances of accidentally drifting across a series of 8 or more specific water gaps in the correct sequence to land on Sahul are statistically 0. It just doesn't work. The journey had to be intentional. This is where things get really fascinating. Intentionality implies planning. It implies purpose. These people didn't just fall into a new continent. They chose to go there. But why? We can't know for sure, but we can speculate. From many of the islands in the Wallacean chain, you can see the next island on the horizon. At clear day, the high peaks of the next landmass would have appeared as a faint smudge of blue or gray in the distance. This is called intervisibility. It's not a blind leap into the unknown. It's a journey to a visible, if distant, destination. Perhaps they were driven by population pressure. The resources on their home island were becoming scarce, and they needed to find new territory. Perhaps it was social dynamics. A group splintered off after a dispute and decided to make a new life for themselves across the water. Or perhaps it was something more fundamental to the human spirit. Curiosity. The desire to see what was over the horizon. The same impulse that would eventually drive people to climb Everest and go to the moon. Whatever the reason, they organized themselves, built their rafts, gathered their tools and supplies, and set off. This wasn't a casual afternoon paddle. It was a major undertaking. A 100-kilometer ocean crossing on a simple raft would have taken days. They would have been exposed to the sun, the wind, and the waves. They would have needed to carry food and fresh water. They would have needed to navigate. They would have had compasses or GPS. Their navigation tools were the sun, the stars, the patterns of the swells, the direction of the wind, and the flight of birds. This is sophisticated environmental knowledge. This is science in its most practical and ancient form. And they had to do this with a group of people. This means language and social cooperation were essential. A leader had to convince others that the journey was worth the risk. They had to work together to build the rafts. They had to coordinate the voyage. They had to care for the children and the elderly on the way. This was a complex social operation. It required the kind of cognitive and social skills that define modern humans. So, let's come back to the word sailor. If you define a sailor strictly as someone who uses a sail to harness the power of the wind, then the first Australians probably don't qualify. There's no evidence for the use of sails 65,000 years ago. That technology appears to have been invented much, much later. In that narrow sense, the term might be anachronistic, but is that really what we mean? If a sailor is someone who possesses a deep understanding of the sea, who builds vessels to travel upon it, and who intentionally navigates across open water, then the answer changes completely. In that sense, these people were not just sailors, they were the first great maritime explorers in human history. Let's compare them to other famous seafaring cultures. The ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians were navigating rivers like the Nile and the Tigris thousands of years ago. But those were rivers, not oceans. The ancient Minoans on Crete were traveling around the Mediterranean Sea, but that was around 4,000 years ago. The Austronesian expansion, which led to the settlement of the Pacific Islands like Hawaii and Easter Island by the incredible Polynesians, was a monumental feat of navigation and seamanship. But that started only about 3,500 years ago. The Vikings, famous for their longships, were raiding and exploring a mere 1,200 years ago. The first people to reach Sahul did it more than 60,000 years before the Vikings. They did it 30,000 years before the last Neanderthals died out in Europe. They did it at a time when most of humanity was still locked into a terrestrial, pedestrian existence. They were the pioneers. They were the ones who first proved that a large body of water was not an insurmountable barrier, but a pathway to a new world. The achievement is staggering. It fundamentally changes our perception of our deep ancestors. These were not primitive people in the way that word is often misused. They were not grunting cavemen struggling for survival. They were anatomically and cognitively modern humans just like us. They had complex language, symbolic culture, and a profound understanding of their environment. And they had courage, the courage to leave the world they knew behind and set out across the dangerous, unpredictable sea towards a land they had never set foot on. The evidence for this journey isn't just in the logic of geography. The archaeological sites in Australia provide the firm anchor. Places like Majid Bebe show human occupation layers with stone tools, ochre crayons, and other artifacts dating back 65,000 years. This is the A in our A to B story. We know they started somewhere in Sunda and ended up at B, Sahul. The water in between is the undeniable evidence of the journey. Genetics adds another layer of proof. Studies of the DNA of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans show that they are descended from a single ancient founding population that arrived on Sahul and then remained in relative isolation for the next 50,000 years, developing an incredible diversity of cultures and languages across the continent. This wasn't just a single event, but the beginning of a long relationship with the sea. After arriving on the main continent of Sahul, people continued to make water crossings. They reached islands like New Britain and New Ireland in the Bismarck Archipelago, which required further sea voyages of up to 150 kilometers around 50,000 years ago. They reached Manus Island, which is over 200 kilometers from the nearest land and was never visible from shore, at least 20,000 years ago. This shows that maritime skills were not just a one-time fluke, they were a core part of their culture and technology retained and developed over countless generations. So, were they the world's first sailors? If we get bogged down in a semantic argument about sails, we miss the point. The point is the accomplishment itself. They were the world's first people to deliberately cross large stretches of open ocean. They were the first to use watercraft to colonize a new continent. They were the world's first mariners, the first seafarers, the first great maritime explorers. The label we use is less important than the reality of what they did. What they did was demonstrate a level of ingenuity, planning, and bravery that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate. They pushed the boundaries of the known world in a way no one had before, and in doing so, they opened a new chapter in the human story. A chapter where we were no longer bound to the land. A chapter where the oceans became not just barriers, but highways. This journey is not just a dusty piece of prehistory, it is the foundational story of the Australian continent. It is the beginning of a relationship between people in this land and people in the sea that has continued for 65,000 years. The deep spiritual connection that many coastal Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have with their sea country today is not a new thing. It is a modern expression of the world's oldest and most enduring maritime culture. So, when we look at the sweep of human history, at our species' long journey across the planet, this is one of the pivotal moments. The moment we learned to cross the sea. And the people who did it first, the people who made those perilous journeys on bamboo rafts across the turbulent waters of Wallacea, were the ancestors of the first Australians. Whether you call them sailors, mariners, or seafarers, they were the trailblazers. They were the ones who showed us the way.